Welcome to the Lock Talk webcast series brought to you by BreachLock, a global leader in offensive security solutions offering continuous attack surface discovery, penetration testing, and red teaming. Hi, I'm Chesbrough, and I will be your host and moderator today. Today's webcast is Navigating Cybersecurity Regulations in 2025. The cybersecurity regulatory landscape is changing at an unprecedented pace, with new frameworks and directives shaping how organizations manage cyber risks. Enterprises of all sizes now face stricter requirements for risk management, supply chain security, incident reporting, and compliance, introducing new complexities for businesses to navigate. Today, we'll explore how new and existing regulations are reshaping the cybersecurity ecosystem, the challenges they present, and the steps your organization can take by pushing beyond compliance with a proactive approach to securing your entire attack surface. Now, I'm excited to introduce our guest speakers. Our first guest speaker is Vishal Verma. Vishal is the Vice President of Pentesting Solutions for BreachLock. He is a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience in information security and governance, risk management, and compliance solution implementation. Before joining BreachLock, he worked for blue-chip companies like IBM, Ernst & Young, and Deloitte in defensive and offensive security and in consultant, auditor, and architect roles. He is a certified professional with credentials that include project management, information system security, and cloud security. He is ISO certified, an Archer certified associate, and a certified payment industry security implementer. Welcome, Vishal, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on here. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Our next guest speaker, very excited to have with us, John Rasmussen. John is a seasoned cybersecurity leader with over 25 years of experience. He has held pivotal roles, including Senior VP and CISO at Syneos Health, VP and CISO at MedStar Health, and CISO at Oregon Health and Science University. He is a respected authority serving on the board of directors for Health Information Sharing and Analyst Center, or ISAC, and various healthcare advisory boards. An accomplished author, John's contributions extend to textbooks and medical device cybersecurity guides. Currently a senior analyst at Tag Cyber, John continues to shape the cybersecurity landscape through consultancy and expertise. Welcome, John, and thanks for joining Locker Talk as our guest speaker today. We're pleased to have you.
Thank you, Ann. It's a pleasure to be here. One correction, I no longer sit on the board of the HISAC. I have in the past.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. All right, so before we start, I'd like to go over just a few logistics. If you have any questions during the discussion, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will try to answer them. We will also take some time at the end of the webcast to take questions from our audience. And lastly, today's webcast is being recorded and will be made available on demand at breachlock.com after this live airing. So let's jump in. All right, the first question is for you, Vishal. As we approach 2025, what are the most significant regulatory shifts organizations should be aware of?
Sure, definitely. That's a great question to kind of start off with, and right, because this is where we are kind of talking about, let's say, kind of laying down a strong foundation about the context that we are going to kind of take a deeper dive between me and John together, right? So we see new regulations, right? A lot of new regulations which are coming into play in 2025, or I would say which are being shaping the future for 2025 in terms of cybersecurity. And they dictate more stringent requirements for pen testing across several sectors, right? Especially in the European Union, we see a kind of trend there, right? These directives and regulations have a major impact on how the pen testing or the cybersecurity world has been perceived by organizations, right? So earlier it was more like a one-time activity that we see, but now it's been shifted towards more continuous threat-led or scenario-based assessments, which provide an organization a more comprehensive overview on the risk and threats that they face as of today, right? And if I talk about the regulatory shifts, right, there are a few that kind of tops the chart there. One being DORA, right? So that's the Digital Operational and Resiliency Act, right? Which is becoming enforceable in January 2025, which is around the corner. And it kind of mandates threat-led pen testing as well as continuous security assessments as well on the critical infrastructures from a resiliency perspective, right? To proactively manage threats and risk an organization may face, right? The other one, I would say again, coming in from the similar side of the geography, the European Union side, the NIS2 Act, right, which is again topping it up, or let's say kind of having an enhanced or expanded version of its predecessor dated 2016 to strengthen cybersecurity and operational resiliency across different sectors, right? And these directives and acts kind of come into play to enhance the overall strategy to emphasize on cybersecurity resilience across regions, right? And with the implications of international organizations operating or connecting to the EU market, they're going to definitely have an impact there. The third one that I definitely, again, want to touch upon on the similar side of the geography there is the Cyber Resiliency Act, which is not yet fully implemented, but it definitely comes into play with emphasis on performing penetration tests on digital products, right? And again, coming into part of the critical supply chain assessments. But we also have to understand, I would say, if I talk about the initial question that you asked me, right, the significant shifts, the regulatory shifts that the organization should be aware of, these are the ones definitely. But it is very important also to understand what are the driving factors behind these regulatory updates that come into play, right? One is predominantly coming into play from a rising threat and sophistication of cyber attacks, right? So we come in from an offensive security, and we see day in, day out, the sophistications of the cyber attacks being more crafty, right? The adversaries are more creative in nature now. The second thing is the expansion of a digital footprint of an organization, right? So organizations are expanding their footprint digitally, and which kind of attracts or poses a threat, or let's say opens up the floodgate for an attacker to come in, right? The third one is again growing security implications, right? So there are heavy fines come into play for security implications or security breaches, and that's where these regulatories and acts have to be very, very stringent upon. And the last one is again the compliance and the customer requirements, because if I'm a customer and if I'm dealing with an organization which is into offensive security, I definitely expect them to be very much aligned and abiding all the principles and directives set forth by these stringent regulations coming into play, right? So that's what I definitely kind of see an organization that should be aware of, that what are the changes in the regulation, when are they being enforced, and when are they becoming applicable to them, and then what are the very specific requirements of those regulations and acts that they have to kind of abide by, right? So that's where I draw the line, saying yes, an organization should definitely be aware of what their exposures are, both the sides, regulatory as well as the cyber risk side.
Yeah. And thank you for that, Vishal. And we should, comment that DORA especially is going to have more far-reaching implications, especially here in the US for global financial institutions. So really important. I think January 17th, 2025 is that deadline. So thank you. John, based on, a little bit about what Vishal has said, and of course your experience, how are these regulations raising the bar for risk management and cybersecurity practices across industries?
Well, so to take a step back first, there are other regulatory changes that are going to come down the pipeline. DORA and NIS2, very important, but they're updating HIPAA from 2013, and that's going to be coming out soon, as well as continued guidance that we're getting from the SEC and other organizations about how to enforce the cybersecurity rules there. In addition, PCI 4.0 is going to be coming into play this spring as a requirement as well. So it's global. It's not just one sector or
absolutely.
It's going to be out there, and this raises the bar from an operational perspective in many ways. One, it increases the cost of doing governance and risk assessment for a cybersecurity team. Two, there are no really good unified cybersecurity tools out there that will do the scan, the evaluation of the importance of that vendor relationship, or do any weighting that will help you address the biggest threats first. So you really need to adopt a threat assessment continuing model to understand what your highest threats are, your biggest business risks are going to be, so that you can prioritize your resources and address them one at a time. From my past work, we worked with a lot of different companies as a subcontractor. We would be covered under NIS2 and probably under DORA 2 for providing some IT services. That said, our clients had provided us with over 30,000 vendors that we had to work with to provide them with services. From a cybersecurity governance perspective, trying to keep 30,000 potential vendors aligned with these rules is a big challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And a really good point. And Vishal, I see you nodding your head there, especially as, BreachLock is moving toward integrating more of their tools into one platform. And I think it lends itself nicely to the next question and to John's point. What role is offensive security expected to play in meeting these regulatory requirements, and how can organizations integrate this into their security strategy?
Right, definitely. I'm gonna touch upon on the thread that I would say where John left about, right? There is no unified tool available, right? So that's where a lot of security strategies have to kind of come together for an organization to kind of help them reach the end goal that they're trying to kind of see. And how offensive security kind of plays a very important role is because, right, so the regulatory changes that are coming into play, right, it shifts the paradigm to an organization to be more proactively in identifying vulnerabilities, right? Doing simulated attacks or identifying offensive security practices that align with the regulations like threat-led pen testing, for having a very robust risk management posture, incident prevention, right? And even the security validation. So I'm gonna just kind of lay down a few examples there that we see day in, day out from an offensive practitioner's perspective, that kind of ties down back towards the compliance and the regulatory requirements, right? And having a very integral part of an organization's security strategy. One is that we see the pen testing now being embedded as part of their regular operations, right? Not just like one-time activity that they were doing earlier, but now it's part of their continuous security assessment and their day-to-day operational activities. You talk about CI/CD pipelines, you talk about the CTEM solutions, you talk about ASM being part of it, right? So all that kind of fits in to specific blocks from a security strategy perspective, right? And the shift from the one-time assessment to a continuous security assessment is definitely a paramount step that the organizations are doing, I would say, and that's where the offensive security starts to come into play. The second aspect is more from a, I would say, custom scenario-based approach, right? You talk about red team, purple team, threat-led pen testings. If I talk about DORA being the directive, the Cyber Resiliency Act being the directive, all those requirements, or even FedRAMP, I was reading through the article there, so they brought in red team mandatory requirements as part of their new publication, right? So if I talk about these aspects there, that kind of starts to fit together into the offensive security strategy for the organization. And these test kind of mandates a sophisticated ecosystem level test, right? Not just a pinpointed specific assessment. And by integrating these offensive strategies into the organization's security overview, let's say the roadmap, not only kind of helps the organization meet the regulatory requirements or expectations, but also helps them improve the overall security posture, right? Ensuring resiliency against the evolving cyber threats that they currently face. Then proactively manage and mitigate their risks and enhance the incident cyber response capabilities that they currently have at hand, right? So that's how I definitely can see offensive security play a very integral role with these regulatory requirements into an organization's strategy or security strategy roadmap altogether.
Yeah. And John, I see you taking some notes there, so I suspect you have a little bit to add. So I'll.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things we have to consider too, 101 basic thing for cybersecurity is asset management. And if your organization goes into this process not knowing who your third parties are who are providing you with stuff, you're going to end up with an empty shell. You kind of know what the risks are, but all of a sudden a business unit that's doing some development is engaged with a third party and they're not compliant. And then all of a sudden it's your liability. So, it's very important for organizations to be aware that they should have centralized management of their contracts and their relationships with their service providers so that they can ensure the focus on meeting these requirements. And one way we can do this is through the contracting mechanisms and working with cybersecurity and legal to make sure that the right requirements are in the contract to conduct analysis, do site visits or audits for those third-party providers, and to ensure that they do some kind of an attestation for whatever regulatory requirement. That's included in an annual update to you as an organization, as a customer to them.
Yeah, and I think that takes us to, the next question, and we can dive into this a little deeper, because I think this is in your wheelhouse. You mentioned healthcare, especially, whether it be pharma, healthcare systems, hospitals have a huge supply chain network. And so, DORA and NIS2, we've talked a little bit about this, but with the update in HIPAA and all the other regulations, they're really putting an emphasis on supply chain security. So can you address a little bit more about, third-party risk and how we can secure vendor relationships?
Sure. As I mentioned before, it starts with the negotiation process, making sure that you have a clear key performance indicators, measurable results, and measurable security that you're applying when you bring the vendor in the door. For healthcare specifically, we're reliant on so many different vendors. These could be medical device manufacturers, they could be pharmaceutical suppliers, that sort of thing. And in some ways, you're accepting a black box. And so it's been a very important quest for the Food and Drug Administration here in the U.S. to provide guidance to medical device manufacturers about how to deal with risks and what information you have to provide back to the care provider regarding security of those devices. And we've come a long way, but not every manufacturer or provider is subject to a legal requirement here in the United States, other than maybe a state privacy requirement. In Europe, it gets into different cases because a lot of this is considered critical infrastructure under NIS2. And so everything down the supply chain is part of that critical infrastructure that's required for the NHS to keep moving, that's required for these other state-sponsored activities to happen.
Yeah, I think some really good points. Vishal, did you want to add something to that?
Just one thing to kind of add on to, because John did cover it well there, right? So, but when we talk about the supply chain and the vendors, right? So there is definitely a very collaborative approach that has to kind of come in between those two parties together, right? From a security audit and ensuring all the data security standards are enforced, right? So the organization kind of engaging into a supply chain vendor, right? Bringing in a vendor there, they definitely kind of have to kind of set out the benchmarks there, because they are more exposed toward regulatory exposures than to their vendor specifically, though they are part of the supply chain as well. So that's where security audits, kind of maintaining minimum security standards, comes into play at hand, because that's where they would give you a matrix as well, as John rightly said about the KPIs there, right? So that's where you would start to kind of drive those KPIs together from those minimum requirements to measure and maintain those compliance postures and regulatory, I would say, requirements being met together with the supply chain vendor you bring in.
So we've talked a little bit about the supply chain. We're going to kind of switch gears here a little bit. And as we can see, the regulations are really covering more sectors. They're specifying more detailed risk management protocols, and continuous monitoring is a big part of these new regulations. Vishal, can you talk a little bit about that and expand upon that?
Sure, definitely, Anne, right? So if I kind of take an example for NIS2 directive specifically, right? So it kind of talks about and builds onto the original NIS directive, which is expanding its scopes and making it more rigor for an organization to kind of undergo risk management. And then I would say it introduces a very stricter compliance requirements. So there are two things that come into play, or let's say kind of go hand in hand. One is the risk requirements, and the other one is the continuous security monitoring, because they keep on feeding onto each other, right? So I'll start off with risk management activities first, right? So the directives, right, the regulations that we are talking about, all boils down to kind of have a very robust risk management framework for an organization, right? And that requirement comes in from an organization having an implemented policies, procedure to address cybersecurity risks very systematically, right? So that's the first requirement comes into play. The second one is the technical and operational measures, right? Any organization that comes into play under the purview for these directives or even regulations, they need to have tools, technologies, both the sides, right? So if I talk about technology, the tool, infrastructure components, systems like I would say John was mentioning about the systems, and then the organizational aspect, the process, policies, and even the training and the human resources to ensure there is a robust security or cybersecurity program or risk management program to play. Then very clear procedures for detecting and responding to the cyber incident, then governance and accountability, and NIS being talked about, right? So there is very specific sector-specific adjustments that come into play, and these directives or this directive specifically talk about varying need across different segments like healthcare, energy, transportation, right? They require a very specific tailored approach for specific risk and criticality level. So that's the first side of the coin, right? So if I talk about the second side, right, the continuous security monitoring capability, that's where we all started off, right? So it kind of continuous monitoring kind of acts as a cornerstone for these directives, right? When you approach a cybersecurity risk management, right? Because continuous monitoring kind of talks down onto a two-pronged approach. One is the real-time threat detection, right? That's where the continuous monitoring tool enables an organization to detect and respond to threats in close to a real-time situation, and that basically kind of reduces the likelihood of a successful attack, right? And tools like SIM solutions, IDS, IPS, the sophisticated EDR, and even the XDR solutions comes into play for an isolation and mitigating or adding more hurdles to an attacker to reach their end goal and bringing harm to the organization. And the second one is, again, ongoing risk assessment, right? The continuous monitoring ensures the risk assessment programs remain up to date, which even I would say the systems, the sophistication of the systems are even to the file level integrity check. So the moment any new vulnerability is being introduced, any emerging threats comes into play, or even a shift into the IT landscape are being getting detected and being prevented for an organization, right? So this shifts from, I would say, this shift basically kind of underscores the importance of a more adaptive, proactive, and well-governed cybersecurity approach for an organization. And this is basically two-pronged approach for continuous risk management and continuous monitoring kind of go hand in hand for an organization.
Sure. Excellent points. And John, your thoughts around, automation playing, a bigger role in regulatory compliance.
Having done a number of board presentations, one of the things they always ask you for are metrics, and they should be quantifiable metrics. And it's very challenging to come up with security metrics that the board is interested in, especially if you're going to introduce additional cost. So security is already a high cost center. We don't contribute money back to the organization. And now with additional regulatory requirements, we become even more expensive. And it's not focused in an area that is easily automatable. It is a very high touch area, so it could add a lot of human costs to it. The best way to approach this is a systematic way where we automate the scans, we automate the results, we do visualization of those results, and then we present the results back to the stakeholders, whether that be the board or the IT teams who are going to be managing the vulnerabilities. Also important is creating that relationship with the vendor who's providing the product, so that if you identify a vulnerability, you are not putting yourselves at additional risk or liability, that you have a good trusting relationship with that vendor. Because you want to be very careful if you're identifying weaknesses in a vendor's product, you want to be very careful about how you handle that relationship.
Yeah. And Vishal, you have a lot of experience on that. Anything to add there?
Nothing in specific there. Definitely kind of John touched upon all those areas. I might be just kind of reiterating that in a different way. But yeah, if I talk about the vendor management there and automation coming into play for sure, right? Again, prioritizing as John kind of left the thought there, right? So if there is vulnerabilities or security holes being identified into a product, right? That's where you have to be very, very careful about. That's where, again, a robust risk management and a vendor management program comes into play, wherein you, I would say, kind of even inventorize your vendors, right? You do a risk assessment policies or risk assessments onto your vendors, and then you start to kind of pick and choose basis the criticality of that vendor kind of comes into play, or even the assets that they are touching upon in your organization, right? And all those security measures that we briefly touched upon in the previous context, right, comes into play for drawing out matrices. As John mentioned, it is very difficult to kind of draw out security matrices, but then again, it is absolutely important for an organization to kind of keep a tab on it, or control on it. Otherwise, they are the one who are going to get exposed towards the regulatory implications and penalties or fines that comes along with the breaches, or let's say kind of deviations that comes along with these regulatories.
Yeah, I think it's about, John's point about making sure that we're giving the right story and the right information and data that has business value to boards,
Yeah.
and to executives. So that can be difficult at times, but it really is imperative. So as we close and we head into the Q&A from the audience, I'd like to ask both of you a question, and I'm going to start with John. It's really a forward-looking, question. And it's, as we look to 2025 and certainly years beyond that, how do you see the regulatory environment reshaping the cybersecurity landscape?
Well, this is the perfect question at the perfect time. Here, we just had an election, and things will change from a regulatory perspective. I don't know if they will go lighter regulation or tougher regulation, clarification of regulation, or ignoring regulation. So from a US perspective, there could be a lot less risk that's exposed to an organization for non-regulatory compliance under a new administration. However, if we see in Europe with DORA and NIS2, they're going a little bit more hardcore on the regulatory requirements, and they've not been shy about giving out penalties for violations of GDPR. Mm-hmm. I think the success and the growth of the cybersecurity realm in Europe is going to change if there's an appetite for enforcement from the EU. When we talk about DORA is a requirement versus NIS2 is a directive. Yeah, they're enforced on different levels. So with DORA, the full force of the EU is going to be applied to that, and that's going to be your financial sector and your IT services sector. And so I think that's going to be helpful to build some security programs, but you have to have something connected to it to help the little guy achieve that compliance. It's the way they define these businesses. A large entity is 250 employees or more. That's a very small entity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some really excellent points. And Vishal, from a provider perspective, I'd like you to share your point of view on how you see these regulations really reshaping what we do as well.
Yep, definitely. As John touched upon on the US side of it, right? So we started off with the EU side, right? So I'm going to talk about the EU or even the general overview, right? The regulations, or let's say the regulatory shift that we have seen so far, right? Or the changes that comes into play are primarily focused more onto an organization being proactive, right? From an adversary standpoint or a cybersecurity standpoint perspective, right? And that's where I see the focus being shifted from a reactive measure to more being proactive in nature. And that's where the outlook is kind of shifting towards, and organizations are being pushed forward to maintain or to go into the direction of continuous security assessment versus one-time security assessment, right? Enhancing and focusing more onto their risk assessment methodologies and capabilities. And the third very important aspect is their incident response and management capabilities being enhanced as well, right? So that's where the organizations are becoming more proactive in nature, or these directives are basically kind of pushing the organizations to be more proactive in nature. And I would say these requirements are kind of forcing organizations more to adopt the technologies, or let's say methodologies like CTEM, right? Continuous threat and exposure management. Because if I look at even DORA, NIS, GLBA for that matter as well, or Cyber Resiliency Act coming into play, they pushes the organization to be more proactive, know their threat landscape, know their attack surface management, then perform continuous security assessment, right? So I would say kind of summarize how I'm seeing the reshaping of the cybersecurity landscape is the organizations are more adapting towards proactive approach. Solutions like CTEM, attack surface management, continuous security assessments coming into play, just to kind of stay ahead in the game, or let's say ahead in ever evolving these cybersecurity and regulatory landscapes. So that's where I would summarize my thoughts around.
Super. Thank you, Vishal. And thank you, John. So we're going to head into the Q&A portion of the webcast. We do have a few audience members, participants that have sent questions. And the first one I'm going to pose to you, John, since we've talked a little bit about it. But it says, how do I ensure that smaller vendors in my supply chain who may not have the same, security or compliance resources as larger partners, how do I make sure that they meet the necessary security and compliance standards? And this comes from one of our customers, actually.
This is basically going to be an administrative control. Since you won't have complete technical oversight of that partner, you have to require on your contract language and your requirements in order to make sure that they have the controls in place to meet those requirements. And sometimes a vendor will go out and get an attestation or do an annual attestation and provide that back to you as demonstration of compliance. I would caution people to be vigilant around those kind of attestations. So SOC 2 Type 2 audit can come from Amazon Web Services and not the vendor itself. And that SOC 2 Type 2 does nothing to improve your security posture. And there is no such thing as a HIPAA certification. There are, HIPAA compliance programs and alignment with the controls, but if somebody tells you that they're HIPAA certified, that's not a real thing. So make sure you do your due diligence and make sure that your vendors keep up on things like attestations, like PCI compliance, because those will provide you with evidence that can support your case for that strength and security.
Absolutely. Good points. Another question that has come in, and I'm going to give this to you, Vishal, and it says, how will the regulatory environments affect the balance? And maybe we'll rephrase this to say, how do you see human-led and automated security measures and the balance between the two in meeting regulatory requirements?
That's a great question, because we talk about a lot about the automation capabilities and then the human-led pen test, right? So I'm going to talk about both the aspects there, right? So if I talk about the cybersecurity regulatory requirements, right, they have a very significant impact on how the balance would be between a human-led pen test, or let's say a human-led assessment versus an automated or a cybersecurity or continuous security assessments in several ways, right? But I'm going to touch upon on two major areas. One is the increased demand of automation comes into play from two major aspects. One is the compliance at scale, right? So if I talk about an enterprise organization which have thousands of assets at hand, right, and these requirements comes in to a continuous monitoring, or let's say a very periodic security assessments of all those assets there, right, which is kind of next to impossible, or kind of poses a very human intensive efforts to an organization. So that's where automation starts to kind of take, or let's say that the scale starts to tip towards the automation there, because we have to have compliance at scale, right? The continuous monitoring, the automated systems kind of help an organization scale those repeatable or data intensive tasks more efficiently and consistently. And then the real-time threat detections, right? So we touched upon on GDPR, very specifically on notifications, right? There are customer obligations that comes into play. So these stricter requirements and rapid responses for threats, I would say threats response, or even for a notification to the customer, definitely demands more automated system, or let's say AI-driven threat detection and response systems, right? So that's where the scale starts to tip towards the automation side. But if I talk about the human aspect coming into play, right? So the oversight and very strategic roles that comes into play, right? Complex decision making when you're assessing a security posture of an organization, right? Or onto the offensive side, being a practitioner there, right? Though the automation can help you decide something, but it kind of still lacks the capability of a human brain to kind of have a very neurological order of doing things into a fashion wherein it still can be sophisticatedly or creatively exploited, right? So all those complex decision-making processes are still dependent on a human to kind of act onto, and then the adaptation capabilities, right, to emerging threats, or even to a very specific dynamic scenario that you see or encounter as a human-led pen testing activity, right? So that's where the steps kind of goes down towards the human led. So if I kind of summarize that answer, so the regulatory requirement definitely kind of talks about more towards the shift of a continuous security assessment. So it would definitely kind of increase or heavily involve automation to handle the cybersecurity needs or even the ever-growing complexity. But having said that, right, the human oversight is still remain essential as part of the offensive side, or let's say the cybersecurity portfolio an organization would be able to kind of deal with, right? Specifically onto strategic decision making or interpreting regulations for that matter, right? So where am I going to get exposed on threat-led pen testing versus a continuous security assessment versus a vulnerability scanning, right? So those are the gaps that a human would still be able to kind of fill in, right? So, and in my opinion, if I have to kind of epitomize that, the most effective cyber programs would be wherein you combine both the strengths of the automated capabilities as well as the human approach coming into play to meet compliance, resilience, and adaptability. So that's where the real mix lies.
Yeah, that hybrid approach. Yeah, excellent point. Well, we have time for one last question. I think it's an important one because we've not really talked about this, and I'm going to send this over to you, John. If you wanna send it over to Vishal, you can do that. But I'll start with you, John. So this is from someone who works for one of the largest global financial institutions. And he's saying DORA has some really strict requirements around incident reporting and information and communications technology resilience. And he's like, how should I prepare to meet these standards from a financial institution perspective?
First of all, document. Make sure that you have policies in place and that you've practiced those policies. If you don't have an incident response plan, generate an incident response plan and then test it. There are going to be incidents on a daily basis, probably. Hopefully none of them will amount to a breach or an interruption in service that will impact you from DORA perspective. But it's good to get that muscle memory working so that when something real does come down the road and you have a 24-hour or 72-hour notice as required, that you're prepared to do that, that you have the right stakeholders lined up. And this has to be a multidisciplinary team of stakeholders on your incident response team, which includes your attorneys, risk management, and other leadership, so that you get the right business perspective when you're going into that notification period.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, Vishal, any last thoughts?
Just one more element to that, specifically, right? So John kind of covered all. I would say I'll just kind of add it or sprinkle it with one last bullet there around the incident response capabilities, training and awareness, right? So learning from your past incident become again more like into a cyclic activity to kind of evolve your incident response plan and capabilities there. So training and awareness and documentation and record keeping becomes very important into that element, right? So everything else John kind of mentioned kind of feeds into these areas, and then you keep on kind of enhancing your program using these matrices becomes help you kind of comply or stay compliant with all these regulations, regulatory requirements, or even kind of go above and beyond that, right? So not just specifically to DORA, but it acts kind of as a baseline to you to kind of comply with any other regulation that comes into play.
Super, super. Well, that concludes our webcast for today on navigating cybersecurity regulations in 2025. I'd like to thank all of you who attended, and a big thank you to you, John. We really appreciate you being here today, especially from a CISO perspective. And as always, Vishal, it's a pleasure to work with you. So thank you so much. Please note that this webcast will be made available on demand at breachlock.com after this airing. And if you would like more information about BreachLock and offensive security solutions, please wait for the closing and we will provide more information on how to contact us. So thank you to everybody.